There are so many watercolor techniques, so many ways of approaching watercolor. But one way, which is a rather traditional way, is what this person asked for. She said she would like to see me tackle glazing in watercolor, particularly glazing to change the color of a previously laid wash. So let's do some glazing. First, a glaze is simply a thin, transparent layer of color. It can be done with any medium that has transparent colors, such as oil. You can use glazing with oil, watercolor, acrylic. But the opaque colors don't work really well with glazing, but I won't say it can't be done. But this is how I would approach glazing, or how I do approach glazing with watercolor. Now, you see, what I've already got here is the No-Tan, which we set up in Quick Tip 314. This has to be absolutely dry. The reason I like to set up the No-Tan, especially for glazing, is because that in glazing we're going to have to build layers. We really need for those light and shadow areas to be distinct from the beginning, so it will be a nice guide to us. So there's the first thing. Now, the No-Tan, as I mentioned in previous quick tip, the No-Tan wash has got to be thoroughly dry. And the way you know in watercolor if the surface is dry enough to paint onto is you put the back of your fingers next to the surface, and if they don't feel cool when you lift them up, it's dry. So it should feel the same. You go to the dry paper, the backs of your fingers, how does it feel when you lift it up? You go to the surface here. If it's the same, it's dry. If it feels cool, then this is not quite dry yet. And that does make a difference, because if it's not quite dry, all those watercolor particles are still loose on the paper, and they will float around when you start to paint. So that's the first technical part. Now the next thing is what colors we're going to use to glaze. So we're going to, rather than mixing color, we're going to layer color, one color on top of another. I always like to refer to the subject to decide which colors to use when I'm painting whatever. So in this case, the subject itself is a yellow-orange, and I see that the shadow areas in that yellow-orange are leaning towards red-violet. We can see that right here. You see, leaning towards yellow-orange, between yellow and yellow-orange, that's close enough. And then the shadow areas you see are leaning towards red-violet. Well, in a case like that, if we really want to create within the watercolor a nice translucency, let me say, a good way to do that is not just go directly for the red-violet and the yellow-orange, but choose one and then work out a color scheme that are going to give us variations we're looking for. So if yellow-orange is a predominant color, what you've heard me call mother color in other quick tips, so the complement of yellow-orange is blue-violet. So that's what we would use when we would want to reduce the intensity of yellow-orange. But we can split that, and we can go to either side of the color wheel and grab two colors that will give us that complement. We could go with blue and blue-violet, or we can go one step further and go red-violet and blue-green. Because we have that red-violet as predominant here, that's what I want to do. So I'm going to be working with those three colors, maybe not so much of the blue-green, but you'll see you don't see any blue-green in there, but I'll show you what it can do. All right, so I'll put the color wheel aside and start pulling some colors out. So first of all, for the yellow-orange, I'm going to use the cadmium yellow, cadmium orange light, or cadmium oranges, yellow-orange, cadmium yellow-orange. It's called several things depending on the manufacturer. Cadmium yellow-orange, cadmium yellow, I think it's called cadmium yellow deep in oil. I'm pretty sure about that. But that's what I want to use for the any yellow-orange should do the job. Okay, for the red-violet, I'm going to move into quinacridone violet, and we'll get that activated and out on the palette. So just to give us a start. And then for the blue-green, I want to use the Holbein Viridian tint. Now I know a lot of people oppose using tints because they're not necessarily always the pure hue. I like that color though because it works well as a blue-green in watercolor. A nice blue-green that doesn't eat up everything else. Now there is the phthalo green that we can get, but it's so strong and it pushes other colors aside. So I prefer using the Holbein, it's made by Holbein, Viridian tint. Now just those three colors, and what's the next step? Well, next step, I want to dampen the surface very slightly. And so we'll just use some clean water here, and I'll dampen the surface. And I'll just, I've got to hold my head down, as I always say, hold my head down so I can see the surface. See where the surface is dampened. See the gloss on the surface. I don't want that really wet. If I wanted it really wet, I would spray it and then brush it out. But I don't want it really wet, so I'll just dampen it. And so now this is then going to accept the first glaze without it causing without it causing edges, which I want to do. Now I'm going to go into a very light mixture of the violet. Now remember, we're building layers for color, so we're not going to get the color we're looking for as we build layers. We go towards that. So I want to go in there, but I don't want the brush to be too wet with color. But I'm going to start stroking in this quinacridone violet. Now you see it goes against that no tan. It goes relative violet. Now I'm putting these strokes in sort of to interpret the way I'm moving the brush. I'm putting those strokes in sort of to interpret what we're seeing in the background there in terms of shape. So I'm not just laying it on in a smooth wash, but I want to see that. Now we've got, this is a light right in here, so I'm working this just in the shadow area. And see, I'm using my no tan here to guide me, so I'll stay just in that shadow area. And just throwing these strokes on in very pale wash. I want to be able to see some of that blue come through. And now, when I get to this part, I want that wash to be even paler, because right here we have some really shallow areas right in here on top of this area. So, and also right up in here and in here, all these areas we have shallow. So I wanted to keep that paler. Then I go up and I add a little bit more color to the water as I move into the shadow areas now, as I move along the perimeters into the shadow areas. And where that maybe, okay, we'll just leave it like that. And a little bit darker here. And I don't want to get it too dark too soon, so you have to be careful about that, because even though you can go and lift the color out in watercolor, it does have a tendency to look a little overworked when you do that. All right, now, and so I've got a little bit of a bleed in here, which I don't mind at all. That would just add a little bit of dimension. Now I see just a little bit of a hint of a darker yellow orange inside this leaf. So I'm going to go with a very pale, lots more water than paint, so pale you can hardly see it, and just give this a little bit of a swipe while it's still damp, so it doesn't leave edges. So give that just a little bit of a swipe there, there, and there. A little bit right in here, maybe going a little bit. You see that sort of takes on that the shape of that leaf. A little bit more in here, and then down here, and there, and there, and there. Now, before we can go any further, this has got to be thoroughly dry. So when you're building a watercolor in glazes, it's going to take a lot longer than if you build it just straightforward in direct painting. So we need to let this thoroughly dry and then come back and do the next layer. Okay, now we have allowed this to thoroughly dry, It must be thoroughly dry, or your glazes, the glazes won't act as glazes. The wet layer will blend with the damper layer underneath it if it's not thoroughly dry. So we took that time and allowed this to thoroughly dry. Now I'm going to move into the yellow orange. So what we're going to do here is, because what I want to do in this layer is I want the yellow orange to go everywhere. So this is where the color starts changing here and then begins to develop the color in this area. So I will put so that it will be smooth and we won't see the distinction of brush strokes. I will put another very light layer of water, and once again I will I'll be sure that I don't get that too wet, because if it's too wet, then the color is going to fade. It's going to be much lighter than we intend it to be. And so I'll just watch that very carefully here. And it's better if you don't go back and forth and back and forth. Make a pass and keep going. Blend one brush stroke with the previous brush stroke. And if you see little pieces of paper that didn't get wet, just leave them. They'll be fine. Now, I want to watch that and be sure that it just gives me a gloss. So I'll go into the orange now, and I want the orange to be just very slightly activated. I don't want it to be as dark as the orange is straight from the well. I want it to be slightly activated, and so I'll just start right here. Now watch how the color begins to change as we put that orange over there. And the way watercolor works is that it keeps changing after you put the color down, which is so different from oil or acrylic. With oil and acrylic, you put a stroke down and it pretty much stays where you put it. But with watercolor, the color keeps changing, and so we just keep moving forward, and then whatever it changes to, that's what we respond to. So see what I'm doing here? I'm just allowing those strokes to blend. Now get this, just a little bit more of the orange over here, because I want a little bit. There we go. I want that to be a little bit richer towards the orange on this side. So I'll just keep that going, and you can watch now, see how the color has totally changed. That's the marvelous thing that glaze does. I'm going to add just a little bit more. It's still damp enough so that I can do this. And when you're doing glazes, you can work with degrees of value of the color. In fact, it's a good idea to work with degrees of value of the color in order to get variations. So I'm going to give it a little bit more reinforcement of the orange, the yellow orange I should be saying, just right in here in these areas, just a little bit. Now, once again, we've got to let that dry before we can go further. So this is the time to take a break, go for a walk, do whatever you can do to occupy yourself and not be impatient, because it must dry without help. As the color begins to dry, those particles of paint do whatever they want to do, and they begin to reveal, as it dries, they begin to reveal more and more of that color that they are turning into. Now that this is thoroughly dry, we can move on with the next layer. Now I'm not going to take this to completion. You know, I don't do that in these quick tips, because if we did, it would be hours, because this is the way the glazing process works. We put a color down, let it thoroughly dry, maybe take 15, 20, 30 minutes for it to thoroughly dry, come back, another layer, and so on. I just want to show you the process. And so but the idea is alternate colors, alternate warm, cool, or alternate warm, cooler, cool, or cool back to warm, but have each layer to be different than the layer before it. So, and also don't try to avoid, if you need to do some mixing within a layer, say for shadow, something like that, don't try to avoid that. So what I want to show you in this layer, this layer, is that we can begin to build. Now you see in here, I don't have any specific shapes yet. And so this has reached a point now, as you can see all those colors that have developed just by just three colors of paint, actually, when we take in consideration the no tan color that was underneath it. So we can get all these nice variations of color. On this layer, or at any point while you're building layers, you can also begin to build edges where you have edges in the background or any other kinds of edges. And so I'm going to use this portion to show you something about building edges. Now, when you're building edges, you don't necessarily need to wet the whole thing ahead. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the red violet and use my round brush. And rather than to load the whole round brush with color, I'm going to move in to the color with just the point of the brush. But I've got the brush wet, as you can see on the palette. I've got the brush wet, and there seems to be a cat hair in there. We don't want that. And I'm going to move the point of the brush into the color from the edge and pull the color out. That's the way you control value with watercolor. Rather than just take a wet brush and plop it down into the rich paint, to be able to control the value, you'd pull it out a little bit at a time into another area of the palette until you get the value you want. And another thing you got to watch for when you do that, if this is already dry, there's a chance, watch this right here, see that streak of dry color, be sure that all that is activated. Activated means we have re-wet it. Be sure all that is activated before you go apply it to your painting, or else you'll have a streak of that color on the painting. So that's why watercolor is such a sensitive medium. It requires that you are always aware of what's going on. All right, so now to create the edges, I'll go in, I'll start over here. I'm not going to go the edges of the whole thing, but just kind of show you how this is done. We see the edge here is created by shadow. So what I'll do in this area is I'll just simply work my brush around the edge of this shape into a shadow, to interpret shadow. And I'll keep working, and then I might find that I'd like to develop other shapes like this. Now I'll go so far with developing the shape, you see, just like this, dip my brush back into the water, blot it, and then blend the edge. Now you see what happens there? When you blend the edge like that, blend it into the color underneath, then you have soft edges. So now I'll move back in just the red violet here. Move back into the red violet, and I will develop maybe a shadow area right here, and then come to the edge of the leaf shape here, and then go over to the other side and build an edge. Usually, well, there are several things that can show edges, but when we have an area of shadow beside an area of light, we're going to have an edge. But what we need to watch for when we're building watercolor, and we're building edges in watercolor, that we don't have a hard edge where we don't want it. And we can get that blended just by using a damp brush, the damp tip of a brush, and you get that edge blended that way. So you see now I'm beginning to develop the shadow. I'm beginning to develop the feeling of shadow in here. So I see that I'm just going to make some stuff up here, because you can do that, and it will, as long as you get a pattern of the thing going, you can create your own shapes in it. You don't have to follow exactly the shapes you're seeing. Now I'm going to get just a little bit more here, and then we're going to get this shadow edge against the leaf itself and build that right down. But see, each time I pull the color, the color I'm adding into the color, the wet that's already there, in order to get that so that will all blend into, so all those areas will blend into each other. And so this is called painting in the negative, where you are developing a single shape on the outside rather than on the inside. So I'll just continue to bring. Now I'm going to let that blend down. So I'll dampen the brush, and blend this, let this blend right in. So I'm getting variations in values by using the darker. The red violet is darker than the yellow orange. So by using the red violet as the darker color, I can build in those darker shadow shapes. So I'll move that just a little bit more. Now I want to get down, you see it gets very, very dark right in here. Now I'm going to do something here that, as this moves in, I'm going to do something here that you can do with glazes, or you could do it in 2 steps. But I'm going to create 1 step. I'm going to take the red violet that's in the brush. I'm going to move just to the edge of this blue-green. You're wondering when that's coming in. The blue-green will darken the red violet. If you don't add too much, it will darken the red violet. That's a little too wet. Get that again. It will darken the red violet and turn it a little bit blue-gray if you don't get too much of it. So we need to control that. I'll control it right here and be sure that that's what I'm getting, because I want that darker shadow value right here. So I'll just put that. See, that is nice and dark and it blends right in, and I can pick up more of the blue violet and that will blend right up. See, get a gradation there of that blue violet as it goes up. So we can, using those two in the principle there is using one color to darken another, but keeping it within the same color range as the color you're darkening. So now I can move right in here and give it a little bit more. I'm going to get an edge there if I'm not careful. Now if I want to define a lighter leaf right here, I get those two blended together, and you see I get a nice gradation that goes from that darker color to the lighter color, and can move on around like that. So I want to show you how you can do that now. As you're working the glaze, you can work 2 colors together to create a value control. Now I'm not going to take time to go all the way around here, but I'm going to let that part dry and then show you how we can now create another glaze that can sort of weave that together into what we've already got. So we need to let that dry. Now at this stage, when you're putting piecemeal shadows in like that, I always like to then put another glaze of the original color over the whole thing. It sort of harmonizes it and unifies it together. So that's what this was going to be. And then for this step, I'm going to dampen the whole thing again. Now, so you can see that you can build in parts when you're doing glazing. You can build in parts. Some of those parts you wet ahead of time, or you wet and then apply the paint. Other parts you work wet on dry, where you are doing little edges and things like this. So as I said before, I'm not going to take this to completion, but just far enough to show you the effects of color, or the different color mixtures you can get when you use this glazing technique. And if you continue and build several layers, you will reach a point where if you build too many, you might begin to get mud, so you have to keep an eye on it. But as you build those layers, they begin to get richer and richer. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet this again, and I got too much water that time, I'm afraid. But just dampen again, just a little bit of a gloss on the paper, and I'm watching it just to be sure that that I'm covering the areas, and that it's not going to be too wet, because if it's too wet, the color is going to disperse, and those yellows and oranges have a tendency to want to fade away. So I'm going now back to the yellow orange, and we're going to glaze over everything with yellow orange again. Now this time I might not hit everything in the leaf itself. I want some variations in values of those colors of the leaves. So I won't hit everything within the leaf itself. And there also might be some areas in this pass where I want to control the amount of orange that actually goes in there. So I might want to give this one, for example, a little bit richer. I think I do. I want to get this area a little bit richer, come through right through the edges there, And you see that color just blends right in with that being wet. But I don't want to hit the whole leaf. Let's see, I think I'll bring it right in here and kind of go up to the edges of the leaf there. And now as I'm looking at, I might not want to hit this area over here, but maybe I will. But see, you can make that choice. As you build the glazes, every color does not have to go everywhere. As you're building upward with the glaze work, you can then begin to pick and choose, and also can vary your brush strokes a little bit. So pick and choose where the colors go. So, and then as I'm working this, you see I might choose to even enrich. While it's damp, I can do this. Now, you have to be careful, because if it starts to dry, if this starts to dry too much, you'll get back runs, and you don't want that. So I'm just going to add a little bit more richness to it. I think maybe a little bit more richness in this, over this shadow area right here might be a good thing. And maybe over this shadow area right here, just to get that a little bit more harmonized. Let's put just a little bit more right in there. So you can see, now this has begun to dry, so I've got to be careful. However, after this, you see it's beginning to lose its gloss. If I need edges with the orange, this would be a good time to do it while I'm doing this layer. So I might even want to give a little bit more of the leaf character there with that. Maybe pull this down just a little bit more like that. Begin to give a little bit more of that movement of the leaf character. And then all of these details, like the veins and the parts of the leaf, those go in at the very end, at the very last. So I'm not taking this any further. I just want to show you the process and show you how you can actually build new colors by layering one color on top of another when you're working watercolor. But in order to do that, you have some technical things that you need to be aware of. And so just as a reminder that when you want the colors to live one on top of the other, then the bottom layer has got to be totally dry. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.